Prayers up for Dak Prescott this week, the toughest of all the injuries this season in the NFL. Our hearts go out to him. In fantasy football, though, we got to navigate these injuries, try and be resilient, and Week 6 will be no different on the Fantasy Football Show on radio.com. What's up, everybody? My name is Steven Andrus, joined by Jordan Cohn and Jesse Pantusco from the radio.com sports staff. Every week, we're going to bring you waiver wire, stealthy starts, and streaming options among quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses. We begin, as always, with pick 'em up, waiver wire options owned in less than 50% of leagues. We should mention briefly, Sammy Watkins of the Chiefs left with a hamstring injury. Keep an eye on Mecole Hardman as a potential pickup. Henry Ruggs came back from injury, 118 yards and a touchdown in Week 5. If he was dropped, he's a viable pickup. And then Chase Edmonds, my favorite pickup, if he's still available. Standalone value, even without an injury, to Kenyon Drake. But, Jordan, the biggest news of the week is out of Minnesota.
Yeah, so Dalvin Cook left the game, and then he reappeared on the sideline shortly after, but he didn't check back into the game. As of this recording, he is undergoing an MRI. We're not really sure what the severity of that groin injury is. However, it means that Alexander Mattison is someone that you have to pick up if he is available. He's only owned in around 40% of leagues, which is honestly surprising to me, considering I view him as the top handcuff perhaps altogether in fantasy football. We know Dalvin Cook's health history is a little bit iffy, and we also know that Alexander Mattison has proven that he's a capable running back that can handle a big workload. He has 4.7 yards per carry in his career. He has multiple double-digit touch games where he's converted a similar yard per carry average. Last night was his first one with 20-plus touches in his career, and he converted it into 136 total yards. He's a third-round back. The team likes using him. They like giving him a workload. It's not to say he's going to be the same type of running back as Dalvin Cook, because Cook is on an elite tier that's shared by very few. But when Mattison checks in with a full workload, which very well could be the case in Week 6, he's 100% worth a look.
And this is a guy, Dalvin Cook, who had other injury concerns coming into the season. He tore an ACL in his career. He had a shoulder separation. Dr. Edwin Porras on Twitter at Football Injury Doc mentions that because he didn't have surgery on that shoulder in the offseason, the history of that injury, 55% chance of re-injury. So just because he comes back from the groin doesn't mean he's going to be out of the woods for the rest of the year. Jesse, how about you for waiver wire?
Chase Claypool was the 11th receiver drafted in April. All I have to say is shame on those other 10 teams. Claypool may be the NFL's rookie of the year right now. We're talking about a 6'4", 238-pound freak of nature who clocked a 4.42 at the combine. I think we all thought it would be a case of too many cooks in Pittsburgh, with Claypool, Juju Smith-Schuster, Deontay Johnson, and James Washington all soaking up targets. But with Johnson slowed by a back injury and Darius Slay shadowing Juju most of the afternoon, Claypool went absolutely ballistic Sunday against the Eagles with 4 touchdowns, 1 rushing and 3 receiving, and a career-high 116 yards from scrimmage. Mapletron, as the internet has taken to calling him, is already halfway to double-digit touchdowns with 5 end zone trips on just 17 touches. He's also averaging over 20 yards per catch, putting him among the league leaders in that stat. Obviously, his scoring pace is unsustainable, but Claypool saw 11 targets from Ben Roethlisberger Sunday, and I think his role in the Steelers' offense will continue to grow, especially if Johnson misses significant time.
So I got another wide receiver for you guys. On last week's show, I started out by asking the question, who the F is Travis Fulgham? Let's put some respect on this guy's name, right? I mean, a 6th-round pick of the Lions in 2019 out of the tiny school of Old Dominion, 6'2", 215 pounds, above average agility and catch radius. Just didn't get much looks in the draft because of the school that he played at and the competition that he faced. But here's Travis Fulgham over the last 2 months. August 9th, cut by the Lions. August 10th, claimed by the Packers. August 19th, cut by the Packers. August 20th, claimed by the Eagles. Week 4, game-winning touchdown at San Francisco. 2 catches, 57 yards in that score, but only 3 targets, so he pumped the brakes in fantasy. Week 5, totally different story. 10 catches, 152 yards, a touchdown on 13 targets. And I'm starting to think this is sustainable for this guy who's come completely out of nowhere, one of the more out-of-nowhere guys I can remember in recent years in fantasy football, because there's a youth movement going on in this Eagles wide receiver corps. Alshon Jeffrey and Deshaun Jackson are still on the roster, but they are over 30 and injured. And last time I checked, you don't cut snaps of a guy who just put up 10 and 152 in a score. So I think Travis Fulgham may be here to stay and is absolutely worth rostering in all fantasy football leagues. Let's move on to the stream team, streaming quarterbacks, tight ends, and defenses. Our top pick at each position, owned in less than 50% of leagues that have a good matchup. You can start in week number 6. Jesse, we begin with you with the swag master of all quarterbacks.
Yep, I'm zeroing in on Ryan Fitzpatrick this week. What's the quote from Dazed and Confused? I get older, Fitzpatrick stays the same age. I mean, this guy is the dictionary definition of well-traveled. 16 seasons, 8 teams, but no matter how long his beard gets, Fitzmagic just keeps on chugging. The veteran has topped 300 yards passing in 3 of his last 4 games, including a 350-yard masterpiece Sunday at San Francisco. And it's not just his arm either. The 37-year-old is on pace for over 400 rushing yards and has scored on the ground in 2 of his last 3 games. If Fitzpatrick put up those kind of numbers against the Niners, imagine what he'll do this week against the Jets, who Kyler Murray just burned for 380 passing yards in week 5. Also, are you guys aware Fitzpatrick went to Harvard? I feel like nobody ever brings that up. I have one more recommendation. I think you could also look at Andy Dalton against Arizona. He won't match Dak Prescott's rushing output, obviously, but there's so many weapons in Dallas. He's sure to provide some big fantasy weeks, and this could be one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Could be a guy that is usable for the rest of the season with all those weapons like you mentioned. Jordan, how about you for streaming tight ends this week?
I'm going to go with Trey Burton on the Colts. Steven, you said it best last week. It is tough sledding on the stream team for tight ends this season. But Burton is a guy who, ever since he was activated by the Colts this season, he's had 11 targets over 2 games. In those 2 games since he's returned, Jack Doyle has had 3 targets and Mo Ali-Cox has had 3 targets as well. So he is clearly dominating the target share at the tight end position from Rivers. And the Bengals defense, who is slated to play against the Colts in week 6, has allowed some big games to opposing tight ends. They saw Hunter Henry go for 73 yards, Zach Ertz go for 70 yards. Andrews on Sunday in week 5 had 58 yards and a touchdown. And so Burton's floor could be pretty high if he sees the same target share that he's been seeing. They're not really tough passes to catch. They're usually underneath routes or something like that. Hopefully in the red zone, you can catch, 80 to 100% of what's thrown his way. And so Burton is someone that you can go to if you're desperate.
I appreciate the variety in your pick, Jordan, because full confession, we almost went full stack on the Dolphins offense this week against the New York Jets. And I'm going with the Dolphins defense for my streaming defense of week number 6. Miami is hosting the Jets. The Dolphins in week 5 at San Francisco forced 3 turnovers, 5 sacks, only 17 points allowed to Jimmy Garoppolo and CJ Beathard. And the Jets, as we all know, suck. They are god-awful, tied for first with the Giants in most points allowed to fantasy defenses this season. This isn't rocket science. Start your fantasy commodities against Adam Gase until he loses his job, and maybe even for weeks after that until this franchise somehow figures it out. Let's move on to Stealthy starts. These are players who are typically started in less than 50% of leagues. And I'm going to begin with Damien Harris of the New England Patriots, who, with Sony Michel on IR right now, at least for the next couple of weeks, has taken over the early down role in this New England backfield. There was a lot of hype for him in his rookie season last year, but too many bodies for him to get onto the field. A lot of hype this past training camp going into his second season until he suffered a minor hand injury that put him on short-term IR. In his debut, 17 carries for 100 yards. This week, he gets to face Denver. Hopefully, everything goes well with the COVID testing. They get back on track this week. Even if Cam Newton comes back and plays in this game, that'll lower his ceiling a little bit. But I think he has a stranglehold on the early down role in this backfield with Rex Burkhead and James White competing for passing down touches in this New England backfield. Moving on now to Jordan.
I'm going to go with someone who should be the beneficiary of a high-powered offensive matchup, and that is Christian Kirk of the Arizona Cardinals. He's going against the Dallas Cowboys in Week 6, and even with the injury to Dak Prescott, I expect this one to be a fun, high-paced matchup of two defenses who are prone to giving up big point totals to their opponent. The Cowboys are a particularly juicy matchup for a wide receiver. Only the Seahawks have allowed more fantasy points this season to opposing wide receivers than the Dallas Cowboys. And we know that DeAndre Hopkins is the clear-cut #1 target in Arizona. But Kirk has cut out a nice niche for himself as well. He has a nice rapport with Kyler Murray. He has at least 5 targets in 3 of the 4 games he's played in this season. Yesterday was probably his best game of the year with 78 yards, though he did have a touchdown the week prior. And secondary options are performing well against the Dallas defense as well. Robert Woods went for 100 yards against them, although Cooper Kupp could have been seen as the primary target. Both Ridley and Russell Gage in Week 2 had good performances, and both Metcalf and Lockett in Week 3 had good performances against Dallas. No one is off the table against this Dallas defense, and I expect Kyler Murray to be throwing a lot.
For me, I already talked up one rookie wideout, so why not another? Laviska Shenault is just begging us to play him in Week 6. The Jaguars' jack of all trades has quietly averaged 83 yards over his last 2 games, including 79 yards on a career-high 7 catches Sunday at Houston. Lead receiver DJ Chark hurt his ankle late in that game and could be in danger of missing Week 6. Shenault would obviously benefit from that, and he also has an amazing matchup against Detroit. I guess you could make the argument the Lions will be well-rested coming off their Week 5 bye, but even with last week's breather, this is not a defense to fear. Only 6 teams have allowed more yards per game than Detroit this season. They've also allowed 32 points per game, 4th worst behind Dallas, Atlanta, and the Jets. Playing at home against a team that's lost 12 of its last 13 games dating back to last season, Week 6 has Laviska breakout written all over.
That'll do it for this week's episode of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. As always, if you have any lineup questions or trade questions for week number 6, drop that question in the YouTube comments of this show, and we'll be happy to answer it for you sometime this week. For Jordan Cohn, for Jesse Pantusco, I'm Steven Andrus. Thanks so much for joining us on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show.